As I've discussed recently, my fall and winter garden just isn't doing great. In fact, this is probably the worst fall garden I've had since moving into my current home about 7 years ago. But rather than getting all torn up about it or trying to battle nature in order to save a few kohlrabi plants, I've taken the crappy state of my garden as a sign that it's time to shift gears and change my focus from growing produce to giving my gardens a clearly needed recharge and overhaul. So today, I'm going to talk a bit about what's been going wrong, what I've been doing to recharge my beds for spring, and detail a total rebuild of one section of my garden that I recently completed. One of my big disappointments this fall has been my beets. They took off and started thriving after transplant, but a month or so later, I started noticing a number of them wilting and dying in spite of being adequately watered. After pulling a few, I noticed that the roots had been stripped off the bulbs, causing the plants to completely fail. Now, I'm pretty sure this nasty little beast here is some kind of subterranean cutworm and is the culprit behind the ongoing beet massacre that I honestly have no good way of fighting at the moment. The other stuff I have going in this bed is a bit hit and miss in terms of health. My rutabaga looks pretty healthy, and it seems the grubs aren't interested in eating their roots like they are in eating the beet roots. My bulbing onions are looking pretty sickly, which is honestly par for the course with me. I might be ready to just give up on growing those. My scallions are doing fine, as they're a super easy crop to grow, but the spinach right next to them never really took. The kohlrabi I have going in this bed are healthy, but unfortunately only two of the four I had going here form their characteristic bulbous stem. We've already eaten some of those. These broccoli that I have growing in my patio planters here are still alive and kicking, but they seem to be forming small, undersized heads. I don't really have high hopes that these will produce all that much, but at this point, something is better than nothing. Now, the shallots I planted from sets in mid-October have sprouted, and I'm really hoping these will eventually yield at least a handful of decent shallot bulbs, and I'll likely refrain from eating anything I get from these plants, instead retaining them to plant a larger crop of shallots next year. Finally, I had a dozen or so kohlrabi plants in these two beds that you'll see here that just completely stalled out, never getting much bigger than when I transplanted them out of their starter pots. And even on cool days in the upper 60s and low 70s, they were dramatically wilting in the sun. And I pulled one to take a look at the roots and weirdly found that the root ball never really expanded beyond the size of the starter pots they were transplanted from. I honestly have no idea why these plants stalled out, but I decided to just cut my losses and turn them into the soil before seeding a cover crop of mustard greens. Now, the varieties of mustard I'm planting are intended to act as a biofumigant to help control a fusarium wilt outbreak in my garden. So I'm hoping to grow and till in around in each of my beds before the spring planting season rolls around. Speaking of that, the mustard crop I planted in these beds at the beginning of October actually grew incredibly quickly, and at this point, it's looking like it's ready to be cut down and tilled in. This is a simple but laborious process. The first step is just to take a pair of clippers and start lopping down the plants. And while this goes on, I am going to get a bit meta here and make a kind of sales pitch for my small, struggling YouTube channel. So please feel free to skip ahead if you don't want to hear it. I can't really blame you. Anyway, I've been struggling to grow my channel for a while now. And honestly, I've been wrestling with the question, why would anyone want to watch my gardening videos over all of the many similar options on the platform? And admittedly, I'm not particularly attractive, entertaining, or charismatic, and my videos are blunt and minimally edited, and I'm just making the best sales pitch ever at the moment, aren't I? Honestly, I'm not in a place where I can offer shiny, polished videos that can rival anything HGTV ever put out, but I can offer a DIY-fueled realness that focuses on developing methods to maximize veggie production from small growing spaces, while also minimizing input costs to whatever degree possible. I believe veggie gardening should be an overall boon to the gardener's bottom line as opposed to a drain on it. Also, while it would be cool someday to have my channel monetized and receive a cut of the revenue from the ads YouTube runs on my channel no matter what, I just don't see myself doing things like tacking on a merch store or shoehorning out of place sponsored segments into my videos. So if that sort of thing kind of annoys you, it might be a good channel to stick with. Now, I certainly don't fault other creators for monetizing in this way, as it's not easy to make a living these days, but I honestly just don't have it in me to manage sponsorships and online retail operations at this point. As it is, the gardening I do, coupled with the simple videos I produce, take up pretty much all of my free time, so I just don't have the time or energy to add too much more to my plate. Now, I might install some sort of donate button at some point in case anyone happens to feel generous, but I'm certainly not the type to incessantly beg for handouts. And I think that's more than enough shameless self promotion for now. So it's time to churn in the chopped up greens. I had considered purchasing some kind of powered cultivator for this task, but decided against it. Not only did I not particularly want to spend money on something I probably wouldn't be using that often, but honestly, as everybody can tell by looking at me, I really need the exercise. All the digging and hand tilling I've been doing lately has been exhausting, but I know it's been really good for me. Gardening can be a great workout, and at the end of the day, it's way cheaper than a gym membership. So all I'm doing here is using this edging tool to mince the mustard greens up a bit more. And then I'm going to be using just a garden fork to turn them into the soil. And done. My garden definitely feels way less chaotic and claustrophobic now. And while I was at it, I decided to add a good bit of compost to these beds and churn that in as well. By the time I need the space again in April, everything will have broken down sufficiently. Next up, a major rebuild project. I'd been wanting to rebuild this section of my garden here for a while. Over the years, I assembled this area in a bit of a haphazard, piecemeal fashion before I really knew what I was doing. And the result was an inefficient and cramped space that was uncomfortable to work and move with it. This bed in particular was a huge mistake in that it was so close to the fence line, I could only access it from one side. Further, its position at the southern edge of my property meant it only received direct sunlight late spring through early fall, making it useless a good half of the year. And I had actually emptied this out earlier in the summer to fill this bed here, which I built in the space our chicken coop used to occupy. I then decided to replace this remaining amalgamation of odd shape and size beds with two new beds, each that would have a footprint of 12 feet long by 3 to 3.5 feet wide. 4 feet seems to be the standard width of a raised garden bed, but I find a width of no more than 3.5 feet to be a far more comfortable reach. To help cut costs just a little bit, I resolved to get creative with my design to allow me to use as much of this recycled lumber remaining from the deconstruction of my chicken pen and coop over the summer. But before I could get started on that, I would need to harvest the fall potato crop that I had going here, as they were right in the beds that I was going to need to empty out and tear down for the project. Now, in early August, I planted a total of 117 well sprouted seed potatoes, some of which were holdovers from my spring potato harvest, and some of which were purchased from the organic section of the local grocery store. Now, ideally, I would have waited on this until the first frost killed the plants, but I had time off in November I wanted to take advantage of, so I decided to harvest them at the 90-day mark. Seeing as how I grow only fast yielding early potato varieties such as Yukon Golds, I knew I'd have something of a harvest even after 3 months. Interestingly, my holdover seed potatoes produced a larger and better crop than the grocery store potatoes, many of which just rotted out before emerging from the soil as a plant. And overall, the plants I grew from grocery store stock this time around were just sicklier and less vigorous than my holdover potatoes. Some of the beds that I planted those in yielded really only 2 or 3 pounds, which is really pretty disappointing, considering how much I planted into this. The beds I'm harvesting here, the ones with that sort of peach colored trim, those were where I planted my homegrown seed potatoes. And honestly, they were just bigger, healthier. Everything about these beds was just much better than the back beds where I planted the grocery store potatoes. Never had a real problem in the past with organic grocery store potatoes as seed potatoes. I think it was just a perfect storm this time around of conditions plus maybe seed potatoes, grocery store potatoes that were particularly old and prone to rotting. But I'm always happy to get something out of my potato harvest. And here's everything I got from my fall potato harvest this time around. Just about 50 pounds. And at a glance, on the surface, that would seem like a lot of potatoes. But given the fact I planted over 100 seed potatoes, it's really actually a little bit disappointing. But still, this puts my total potato harvest for the year at 100 pounds between my spring and fall crops. And that's nothing to scoff at, especially here in the Sacramento Valley, which is not known for its ideal potato growing conditions. And with my potatoes harvested, I could start emptying and tearing out the beds that they were just occupying. Now, finding a place to temporarily corral the soil from the old beds was a bit of a trick, as I'm pretty much out of free space in my backyard. Some I was able to stack in grow bags tucked out of the way along the fence line. For some of it, I had to move it like I'm doing here and empty it, move it into beds that had a little bit of free headspace. The beds that I'm moving soil into in this shot, they're too high and in the wrong position for me to get a wheelbarrow in. So I basically had to fill 10-gallon grow bags and walk it over one bag at a time. Super tedious, but again, super great workout. I then got the idea to use one of the old beds I'm replacing to move that along the fence line to tuck it out of the way for temporary soil storage. That barely worked because these were so severely rotted. They came apart when I dragged them, but I was able to tack it back together enough to at least do what I needed it to do for the time being. Quick side tangent, something troubling I found while tearing out my old beds were a number of termite colonies. This is obviously troubling to a homeowner and something to keep in mind when deciding whether to go with wooden raised beds or metal raised beds. And since I had my propane torch handy, I decided to do the only sensible thing in this case and nuke them from orbit, so to speak. Hopefully, this is enough, or was enough, rather, to prevent any kind of spread from the beds that they were already infesting. As I noted a little bit earlier, in order to keep out of pocket costs down on the project, I really wanted to try and use as much of the scrap lumber I had on hand from the chicken pen and coop I tore down over the summer. And because much of this scrap was in odd chunks and weird lengths, I was going to have to get a little bit creative with the design. So in the past, I've really stuck to two basic raised bed designs. The first is simply horizontal sideboards held in place by vertical posts, like with this one here. Now, this design is ultra cheap and is fast and easy to build, but it lacks strength. This is especially true when using cedar fence pickets for the sideboards, which I'm prone to doing as they're both cheap and rot resistant. The second approach I often take is to build a frame out of cheap 2x stock and then run vertical sideboards like I did for these beds here. This is a much stronger design, but it eats a bit more material and takes way longer to build. I do have some earlier videos on how to build both bed types if anyone happens to be interested. The approach I took with my most recent build actually combined elements of both design types. My first step was to make some robust corner posts by screwing together some of the odd lengths of 2x4 that I had laying around after the chicken coop deconstruction, and then cut them all to a length of 16 inches. The more even you can make your corner posts, the easier the project will go. I also cut some, for lack of a better term, wall studs to the same length as the corner posts, and I just made those out of a single width of chunks of 2x4. Next, I joined the posts and studs together across the top via lengths of 2x4. And for this first bed, to make a 12-foot sidewall, I had to join two separate 6-foot lengths of 2x4. Obviously, a single 12-foot length would have been far stronger, but again, I was trying to work as much as possible at the start with the scraps I had on hand. Here's the first sidewall all framed out. To stabilize the bottom, I just ran two 6-foot lengths of recycled 2x3 along what would become the inside edge of the bed. And having a stud or post every 3 feet was supposed to keep the fence picket sideboards from blowing out when I filled them with soil. Here are both sidewalls all framed out. I even managed to make them mostly symmetrical. Next, I joined the two sidewalls together using lengths of 2x3 across the bottom. And I also wound up adding, of course, an end rail across the top made out of a length of 2x4. Here's the first bed all framed out and more or less in the spot where it was going to go. I had it bottom edge up so I can give it a good char job with my propane torch. Now, the idea behind charring, of course, is to add some rot resistance without having to employ any toxic chemical sealants or preservatives. I'm hoping that charring the wood will also make the bed a little less attractive to termites. For the frame, I'm going to go with a fairly aggressive char, getting it to just the point where the wood takes on a slight alligator skin texture in places. And here's the frame mostly fully charred. I'll just have to hit a few spots I couldn't get to at first when I flipped the bed right side up in a little bit. I decided to char the cedar picket sideboards before screwing them onto the frame. And because the pickets are so thin, I had to be careful not to char them so severely as to weaken them. If I was going for, say, charbroiled steak for the frame, here I'm going more for perfectly toasted marshmallows. Next up was installing the sideboards along the insides of the bed. The boards turned out to be just the right length so that I didn't have to do any cutting, and that saved me a lot of time. And obviously, screwing the sideboards along the inside of the frame makes for a much stronger design as the studs and posts prevent the boards from bowing out, hopefully too much. And with the sideboards in place, I was coming to the end of this first bed. I just needed a way to close up the ends. And the way I decided to do that saved a little money at the cost of some tedium. Since I had a lot of 2x3 scraps still lying around, I cut a bunch to the appropriate length, gave them a good char, and then started screwing them to the insides of the end rails. As you'll see in a moment, this did result in the ends looking a little wonky, but this bed is going to be farthest from my house and will be blocked from view by the second bed I'm going to build, so I'm okay with it looking a little off. As expected, the 2x3s didn't perfectly close up the ends, leaving a small gap on each side. Now, the right thing to do would have been to break out my table saw and rip a piece of board to perfectly fill this gap. Instead, I took the lazy route and just tacked a scrap board to the inside end walls to keep the soil from leaking out. Again, I won't really be able to see this bed from my house, so the small imperfections won't be in my face constantly. Here's bed one, complete in place and about as level as I can make it. Before filling the bed in, I did trench a little of the clay soil out from the bottom so I would have something to fill the depression left after I removed the bed that was previously along my fence line. The depth of the bed plus the trench at the bottom will allow for about 24 inches of good soft soil before the roots of whatever I plant there hit the clay slab that is my native soil. There were some design flaws in this first bed I wanted to avoid repeating on my second bed. For one, I wanted to make the ends look a little better. Also, while the overall width of the bed is almost 4 feet, due to the way I joined the sides, the inside growable width wound up being only a little over 3 feet. Finally, using separate 6-foot lengths of 2x4 for the top and bottom rails made for a much flimsier frame than I would have liked. The first design change I made when building the second bed was to add a length of 2x3 to each of my corner posts, turning them into sort of right angle corner brackets. This would allow me to run horizontal lengths of cedar picket along the ends. Here's the frame for the second bed assembled. I sprung for full 12-foot lengths of 2x4 for the top rails on this one, which made the frame much stronger than the first. It wasn't so jiggly and wobbly. I also threw in an extra stud at each end to help shore up the end boards. All right, let's see if I can move this into place alone without throwing my back out. A bit heavy, but ultimately doable. And, not bad for a middle-aged fat guy. And as with the first bed, I charred the frame and secured the pickets to the interior. And I was ultimately much happier with how the second bed turned out. Not only does it look better, but I made sure it had a full 3.5 feet of growable width along the inside. Now we're getting to the finishing touches. Up next, I built some simple vertical frames out of 2x3s and affixed them to the ends of the beds. These are primarily for supporting my shade cloth, but I can also see affixing trellis netting to these if need be. I then gave the top rails a quick sanding just so that no one gets splinters in their butts when they sit on them. And just for fun and out of curiosity, I rubbed a bit of food safe butcher block oil I had lying around into the top rails just to make the grain really pop, if only temporarily. If this is how a cheap 2x4 looks charred and oiled, I'm actually really eager to try making something more ornamental that employs this charred wood finish method. With construction complete, I sowed the mustard green cover crop in the beds. Like I said earlier, I want to get this in every bed before the winter's over. And I reseeded the torn up ground between and around the beds with perennial rye. I chose perennial rye as it's said to do better in clay soil than most other grasses, and it would be nice if it outcompeted the Bermuda grass that has been plaguing my yard since we moved in here. But I won't get my hopes up. Bermuda grass is to the plant kingdom what cockroaches are to the animal kingdom. I'm actually really happy with how my rebuild turned out. Now, I did lose about 10 square feet of grow space compared to the amalgamation of beds that I replaced with these new ones, but the trade off is a less cramped, more efficient, and intentional garden space that is overall just nicer to look at and be within. I was able to install both beds for about $250 out of pocket, which, while not insignificant these days, really isn't bad for two large beds that I'm confident will last me at least a decade. I really don't think I could buy two quality metal beds of a similar size for $250. And with that, I'm going to call it a day on this one. It was a bit of a long one. So until next time, let's hope it all doesn't die.